Hi, Frank.
Hey, Bob. How are you?
Okay, how are you doing?
I'm fine.
So you've got like one of these headsets now, so you're not holding a telephone handset up to your head, so your son will no longer make fun of the way you look on Blogging Heads?
That's right. I'm cool now.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, Frank. We'll leave that judgment to your son, and I'm pretty sure
Okay.
it's not going to come out in your favor. But
All right.
But anyway, you're making progress.
Yeah, definitely.
So you've just come back from this magical mystery tour, or a few weeks ago you did, or something. You went to Russia and Japan and France and Australia, Hungary, and Papua New Guinea.
That's right.
And so I want you to give us a state of the world report, but first I've got to say I really admire your ability to line up these junkets. You know, my goal in life is to travel widely and have somebody else pay for it, and I just haven't mastered it. And if you have any tips, feel free.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how that happens, but actually I spend my time avoiding travel now rather than seeking it out.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, listen, forward those emails. When people offer you travel you don't want, just forward them to me.
Okay, will do.
I'm sure they'd be just as happy for me to fill that gap. So anyway, you went to, one of the places you went was Russia, and you actually,
Right.
you spoke at something where Putin spoke?
Yes.
Is that true?
There was a St. Petersburg economic forum. The Russians are trying to turn this into a competitor to Davos. There had been a group that met annually in London, and they basically strong-armed everybody to move the venue to St. Petersburg, and they put on this unbelievable show to attract people, and basically the message was that Russia is open for business, and indeed there are something like 6,000 delegates there from all over the place, despite various nationalizations of Yukos and other companies, Western businessmen are streaming into Russia, and so they've got a good audience for this.
Well, that's a good sign, I guess. Did you get any FaceTime with Putin?
No, we were actually on I was on a panel with him and Nazarbayev, the president of Kazakhstan, and then there was another group of people that came on after us. So I didn't actually get to meet him, but he and Nazarbayev were in the audience when I gave my talk.
So you didn't get to see into his soul?
No, unfortunately, I didn't.
Oh, well. I'm told that when you get that view, you feel a lot better about things. But actually, I read your blog post on this, and you did seem to come away feeling not so bad about Russia. I mean, one point you make is that, you know, kind of the Wild West days when oligarchs traveled with, you know, gun-toting thugs and really kind of had to, are over, and that if nothing else, the government has done what a government has to do if it's really going to govern, which is establish a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, and that's, you know, and more broadly, there's more reliability and regularity about the way the law works and so on. So there's some degree of at least order that has been established, right?
Well, you have to be very careful in the way that you describe that, because I would say that this is true for a lot of the economy that doesn't rise to the level of these politically sensitive companies like Yukos that deal with the energy sector, or things that deal with the national security state. But that's right, that you know, the classic definition of a state is this legitimate monopoly of force. Whether it's legitimate is a complicated question, because Putin is extremely popular in Russia. He gets poll ratings upwards of 70%, and so there is a broad popular, I think, base of support for what he's doing, and the days of the gun-toting oligarchs is really over. I think that was the significance of the arrest of Yukos's CEO Khodorkovsky. They're sending a clear message that now the state was going to monopolize any use of violence. And at a lower level, things like the court system that was just notoriously either non-existent or corrupt, they've begun to put it back into some kind of working order. So I was told that if you're not a very politically visible businessman and you have a business dispute with a partner You can take it to the Russian court system, and you'll get, not perfect justice, but much better than 10 years ago. But the downside of this, obviously, is that they are not creating a liberal democracy. They're not protecting individual human rights, and the commanding heights of the economy are extremely politicized, and the state is really trying to get has gotten its tentacles into all of the really critical parts of the economy. And so the problem is that in Turkey they talk about there being a deep state which is controlled by the Turkish military, and here that deep state in Russia is not so deep. It's really it's a KGB state. The major people in power come out of the secret police, beginning with President Putin himself, and although there are elections that legitimate their rule, it's an extremely manipulative type of democracy. And so it's something we really haven't witnessed before. It's a combination of democratic, it's democratic in a populist sense, it's not liberal, and it is capitalist, although controlled in a very tight way by the political authorities. So
if you compare it to our kind of ideal model of the way things go, the economy is much more statist. It has these, it's in some sense capitalist, but a more statist form of capitalism, and perhaps relatedly, it's not democratic in the way we think of democracy, although the current government has a lot of popular support.
Well, there's a difference between liberalism and democracy. The liberal part of the formula is rule of law, protection of individual rights, and that's the thing that's really weak. All of the horizontal checks and balances on the power of the executive have been progressively weakened. For example, independent media, which is not part of the formal state but is a critical check on power in any liberal democracy, basically the state has taken that over. All of the major TV channels now are directly controlled by the Russian government, and so although there are very small media outlets that are still dissident, it's very hard for an average Russian to get a view of the world that's not controlled by the government.
Well, yeah, and whenever I hear that, I think, the rate of internet access penetration in Russia must be pretty low, because it seems the government, it's not that it's impossible to exert powerful checks on the internet via, for a government to do that. China has some success, but it's a lot harder than it is to own, half a dozen TV stations. And so am I right, first of all, that the internet is just not yet much of a force in Russia, maybe even not as much as it is in China?
That's probably true, and so TV, radio, more traditional forms of media are consequently much more important.
So they don't have Blogging Heads TV in Russia yet?
Well, they could watch you.
They could.
Yeah.
Liberation is available.
Right. But it's interesting, because if you took a snapshot of where Russia is compared to China, it's actually a more free society. There's more internet access. The Russian government, I suspect, does not try to control it as much as the Chinese government does. There's more civil society. The Russian government controls less, the state sector is less in the economy than in China. The trouble is that it's a dynamic situation, and the Russians are moving very rapidly towards centralizing everything and increasing the control of the government. And so I think people do not, if everything froze in Russia right now, I think we'd have to regard it as a kind of semi-free country. But unfortunately, I don't think anyone expects things to simply stop, and I think there's an expectation that as they get richer, as energy resources keep rolling in, that they will expand both domestically and in foreign policy their state.
Right, and of course, to the extent that an economy is dependent on a resource like oil, continued centralization of power is easier than it might be, if the forms of wealth generation were kind of more diffuse. But on this issue of you're saying they exert fewer checks on the internet than the Chinese government does. That's probably true, but I also think there's a lot less in the way for them to check. I mean, I get the sense that in China the online discourse is very robust in a way that it's just not in in Russia. I mean, it's a real cat and mouse game between the Chinese government and all these kind of online activists who seem to want to do things and sometimes succeed. And that's why I'm wondering if there isn't, I mean, notwithstanding your concern about maybe a trend toward further centralization, if there isn't, going to be this countervailing trend, if the internet really ever catches on in Russia. Maybe it's not merely a technological problem. It may have to do with their traditional feelings about authoritarianism and so on, and whether they're going to be inclined to use the internet. But don't you get the sense that in China there's, in a way, maybe the question is this. You say, and you said this in a blog post, that Russia is more democratic than China. But would you also say that Russia is really more pluralistic than China? I get the sense that in China, grassroots groups of people are managing to get their views felt by the government one way or another, and that the government is kind of intermittently responsive.
Well, yeah, I think the societies at this point in their development are quite different. I think a lot of Russians came out of the 1990s with a really bad taste in their mouth. They saw it not as an opening to freedom, but as a period of extreme chaos, humiliation, weakness. And so I think they are much more inclined to celebrate the return of a strong state. They're much less rebellious against that state. And so you do get people like Garry Kasparov that
the chess
are protesting. Yeah. Very bravely, but they're extremely marginal in Russian politics. And what you don't get in Russia that you do get in China today are these constant rebellions by peasants, by workers, by miners, by people that are being screwed by the system. I think in Russia there's less of that kind of social protest, and there's probably and so I don't know whether this is a deep cultural thing. I suspect not. I think it probably people's attitudes towards things like this depend on their recent lifetime experience, and the one that the Russians just went through was the one of a kind of excess of freedom during the 1990s. And so I think right now they're quite content to have things stable, and it's quite easy, therefore, to buy them off politically by the kind of economic prosperity that they've been experiencing.
Yeah, you also, on the website of your journal, American Interest, when you wrote about your experience in Russia, you described the Russian mindset in a way that reminded me a little of the mindset of radical Islam, in the sense. I mean, let me quote something you said. You said they see the 1990s as a humiliating period of weakness. They believe the U.S. and NATO didn't want democracy, but Russian weakness, and took every economic and political advantage they could while the country was prostrate. So there's a sense of, humiliation by the West after a period of former greatness, and ongoing suspicion about the West's, imperial designs. I mean, am I crazy to see a little bit of a connection there between that psychology and the psychology that motivates radical Islam?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I think it's probably more direct, because with the Muslim world, the past glory is already several centuries away. When they lost Grenada in 1491, Osama bin Laden claims to still care about that, but I think most Muslims have no idea that that's what happened back then, whereas it's happened in the lifetime of most Russians, and so I think it's a very live issue for them.
Yeah.
And I think that's why they're doing all this recent stuff like sending out bomber patrols and just being generally obnoxious in foreign policy, just to assert themselves, showing that they're back and that they can still make a difference in the world.
And I think in both cases we don't really appreciate exactly how our behavior plays out. For example, when we invade Iraq, I don't think we appreciated how many Arabs assumed that was the first step in a plot of, total military domination of the Arabian Peninsula. And of course, it's an open question how far that really was from the plans of some people in the Bush administration, but certainly most people who supported the Iraq War in America didn't have that in mind. And similarly, you know, when we draw, you know, Eastern European nations, former members of the Soviet Union, member states of the Soviet Union, into our orbit, and then kind of top that off with lectures delivered by Dick Cheney about how Russia could govern itself, I think similarly we may not appreciate how seriously a lot of Russians believe that our ultimate goal is much more nefarious than we think it is, right?
Yeah, there's a complete difference in the way that they interpret the same events. For example, the Orange Revolution in December 2004 in Ukraine that brought to power President Yushchenko in this country is celebrated as an act of throwing off a corrupt Soviet-era dictator. The Russians, or at least the Russian elites, see it totally differently, that this was not a matter of democracy. This was invading their post-Soviet space. They had reluctantly conceded that the Baltics and Eastern Europe were out of their orbit, but they believed that Ukraine as a Slavic nation was really, you know, they have a kind of Monroe Doctrine-like sense of their sphere of influence, and they saw this not as an effort to promote democracy, but simply as an effort to weaken them by pulling Ukraine out of their orbit. So, yeah, you're right. They really see things extremely differently.
And you kind of, I guess, close by saying that, but at the same time, we should not have an overly alarmist view of what the Russians are up to, and that we're a little bit guilty of that, and that if you pay attention to their actual behavior, you might be less concerned about some sort of revival of the Cold War than some people are, I guess.
Well, I think that the Cold War, in the sense of a universal ideological struggle that plays itself out all over the world, is simply not going to happen, because, you know, what is it that drives the Russians these days? It's basically money. And they want to maximize their revenues, and they also want these symbolic things having to do with prestige and recognition. But the idea that they'd be supporting a revolution in Central America out of some kind of a universalistic sense of mission, I think that part of it is simply gone. I think the real problem is going to be for Russia's neighbors, particularly what they call the near abroad, places like Georgia and Ukraine and even the Baltics, where I think the Russians are not entirely reconciled to the loss of these areas or the loss of their influence over these areas. And I think they will torment these countries, and I think we have a real duty to make sure that doesn't happen.
Okay. Now, while you were there, as you said, you were on this panel with Putin, among other people, and you gave this talk that you posted on your website about the clash of civilizations, and you framed the question in what I thought was an interesting way. I mean, the question being, you know, is Sam Huntington right that what we're likely headed for is this enduring clash among these huge civilizational blocks having to do with shared religious tradition and ethnic tradition, or are the optimistic kind of modernizers and globalization advocates right that no, ultimately we'll wind up with something much more like a unified global civilization? You cast the question in an interesting way around the concept of trust. And I should say, just by background, that maybe more than people realize, trust is essential for any form of social organization to succeed. If you live in a hunter-gatherer society, you go out on a hunt, you have to be able to trust that whoever you're hunting with is going to do their part in downing the giraffe or whatever, while you're off doing what you do and so on. And you have to trust that overtures will be reciprocated, acts of generosity will be reciprocated. And then if you live in a modern society and don't hunt giraffes, I have to trust that at the supermarket the food won't be poisoned and so on. So anyway, why don't you talk a little about the way you frame the clash of civilizations question in that regard?
Well, first of all, just as a matter of background, there are a lot of Putin supporters and Russian nationalists that really like Sam Huntington, and they, in fact, are trying to embellish on that thesis by arguing that Russia is a separate civilization, that it's not part of this development of the West in which we see modernization leading to greater individual rights, rule of law and ultimately liberal democracy. They would argue that they've got a separate tradition and that they want sovereign democracy or whatever label they come up with, but it's going to have distinctly more authoritarian features than what we're familiar with in the United States or in Western and now Central Europe. And so this is the central issue about whether this is really the case or whether there is a more universal pattern of development of which they're going to partake. And I would say that this is one of the real issues that we're going to have to watch over the next 2-3 decades, because I would argue that ultimately modernization, that is to say economic and technological modernization, does require the creation of political institutions that limit the arbitrary use of power. We've got these two big authoritarian experiments going on now, Russia and China, in which they've finally got the formula right. They've gotten rid of central planning, which obviously didn't work, and they're promoting capitalist development but under authoritarian political systems. And the question is, whose system breaks down first? Does the liberal democratic capitalist system of the West break down, or does their system break down? I'm betting on our system because I do believe that without a rule of law, without formal checks on the power of the state, eventually they screw up. It could come pretty early, when oil prices start crashing. They're going to be in a lot of trouble. I think one of the issues that bears watching is, can you have a whole generation of young Russians that are used to traveling, that have a high standard of living, that are well educated, that are into a relatively free consumer society? Do they continue to go along with an authoritarian politics where they basically have no say, in which state-owned companies are basically run for the benefit of the people that manage the companies and not for the broader society? Is that a stable kind of political system over the long run? And my guess is it's not. But it's working right now, so we'll have to see on that.
Yeah, I mean,
and I guess further the other real question. I'm sorry, I didn't address the question of trust.
Well, we can get back to that, but this is interesting.
Okay.
I actually have a question about what you just said anyway, so go ahead. I'll bring us back to that.
Okay, well, on the question of trust, basically what you had as you modernized is the increasing displacement of informal types of trust based on kinship or who you grew up with or inherited traditions. You replace that with formal institutions. So the reason that we trust the food in our supermarket is not that we grew up with a grocer, it's because we've got an FDA that is looking after food safety, and we believe that the formal institution is the real guarantor of the quality of the meat you buy in the supermarket. And so the argument that I was making was that part of the modernization package, you never displace those informal mechanisms. So Silicon Valley still relies on handshakes and friendships and informal reciprocity, but it has to be underpinned by a much more complex formal system that we call rule of law, that is the real basis of trust. That's why people who are not related to each other, never met each other, can do a business deal in the global economy at the moment. And so that's why I think that the Russians really need to, and the Chinese for that matter, are ultimately going to have to move towards a much broader system of formal law than they've got now.
Okay, and on this, and you, I mean, I should say, and you are ultimately, well, I guess as you kind of said, you're optimistic. I mean, you think more than apparently a lot of Russians appreciate, ultimately the world's what may now seem like distinct civilizations are headed toward the same place, or some, a closer convergence
right.
than some people, certainly Sam Huntington, now think. You remain optimistic.
Right.
But, on that, kind of on that point, you were asking which model will prevail, our more liberal model. I mean, granted that now everybody sees that centralized economic planning doesn't work, still there's some question as to, as to how centralized the power is in a government as opposed to being more diffuse in a more liberal system. It seems to me a kind of wild card here is how successful we wind up being in controlling terrorism without becoming more authoritarian ourselves, right? In other words, if to the extent that we don't check terrorism at what I would call kind of the grassroots level, you know, in other words, to the extent that we fail to just to shut off the oxygen supply to terrorists in the sense of how much grassroots support they have in, you know, notably Muslim countries. To the extent that we fail at that, then an authoritarian government has a real advantage, because then terrorism becomes this kind of chronic thing, and societies like Russia and China, you know, have an edge in stomping out those kinds of, or at least controlling those kinds of threats to domestic security, right? And we will be more drawn to their model.
Well, I guess I don't really agree with that, because I think that controlling terrorism is, I would say, very heavily a political matter, and not simply a matter of coercion or having enough intelligence and then being able to act on it, you know, to physically stop people. I think that, like a lot of police activity, it's actually based on a lot of social capital, that you have to have people within the social class of people that might be inclined towards terrorism, that are willing to report on suspicious activities, to cooperate with the authorities, and the like, and you only get that in a society where you have a certain amount of trust and consent. And so I think, for example, that one of the big advantages that the United States has is that its Muslim minority is pretty well assimilated, and first of all, there's less inclination towards terrorism, there's less alienation, and then, you know, more likelihood that you're going to get cooperation out of that kind of society. Now, of course, there's a lot of variation across the West, and the British don't seem to, you know, they've got a larger population, and they seem to be less successful. But I guess I don't agree with the premise that it's basically police state types of controls that ultimately keep this stuff at bay.
No, that's not what I meant. I meant that if the thing you're counting on fails, okay, that is to say, this kind of grassroots level support that you note that now exists in America, which is to say, large majority of American Muslims don't want to see terrorism. If they see suspicious signs in their neighborhood, they're inclined to report them. You're right, to the extent that that succeeds, we don't need more authoritarian responses, but at the same time, in a way, that needs to succeed around the world. In other words, to some extent, if the British have a problem at the grassroots in that sense, that's our problem, because this stuff doesn't totally respect national bounds. And if all these Iraqis hate us and are fomenting terrorism that might ultimately assume literally anti-American form, that's a problem for us. So what I'm saying is, I acknowledge that the kind of mechanism you see for checking terrorism, that is grassroots, and I would say grassroots around the world, is the desired one. I'm saying if that doesn't work, then what you're left with is authoritarian responses to kind of, keep putting out these fires, and...
Well, yeah, but it depends on really how serious the underlying problem is.
Yeah.
If you've got, hundreds of thousands of people that are just itching to get their hands on a biological or, some other really serious kind of weapon and set it off and just nihilistically kill people, then you've got a real problem on your hands. On the other hand, I suspect that the bulk of people that would be inclined to engage in terrorism are more likely to do things that are actually more traditional, not get into the WMD part, but car bombs and assassinations and trying to hijack or blow up airliners and this sort of thing. And that's a very serious activity, but it doesn't threaten Western civilization. And so I think the kinds of measures that you take in response to that, therefore, have to be calibrated towards the level of threat. It's one of the most, I think, intellectually difficult things to really evaluate properly the level of risk and therefore the kinds of responses that are necessary. But I guess one of my big problems with the way the Bush administration has responded to terrorism since September 11th is that they've assumed that the catastrophic risks are actually much higher than I believe they really are. And if you believe that, then you'll do things like preemptively invade countries or torture people or so forth. But if the actual level of risk is lower, then I think the responses that are then generated can be a little bit more relaxed.
Right, but the problem is people are not very good at rationally assessing risk. I mean, look at the response to something like the Virginia Tech shootings. Now, rationally assessed, the Virginia Tech shootings do not indicate that we face some sort of contagion of spree killings, you know. In the scheme of things, you would be better off worrying about people dying on the highway, or, you know, if you really looked at the numbers. But clearly, if you look at the media coverage in the wake of the Virginia Tech shootings, you know, I would argue people aren't that cool-headed in assessing these things. So just to put together a scenario that speaks directly to what I'm talking about, I think I agree with you. If America faced, look, a car bombing a week, you know, rationally assessed, that would not put the average American at appreciably greater risk than the average American is at now. But you and I both know that's not the kind of assessment that's going to happen. People are going to freak out. They're going to start suggesting things like ethnic profiling at airports. And I've said this before on Blogging Heads, and in a way I haven't been clear enough about it, because I'm not saying that things like, the point isn't so much that if we start doing things like ethnic profiling and things that are perceived in the American Muslim community as oppressive, it isn't so much that will directly, radically increase the number of terrorists. It will make the American Muslim community less inclined to report the suspicious signs and things like that. So anyway, that's the scenario I see.
Yeah,
I worry about is us irrationally responding to threats that, as you say, are not actually that large. That in turn undermining the grassroots kind of anti-terrorism infrastructure we have set up. And that's when I worry about authoritarianism being the chosen response. But you disagree?
Yeah, no, I think that's a risk, but I do think it's something that can be combated by political leadership. And I think one of the problems, you know, in the last few years is that because hyping the threat and keeping people constantly worried about the possibility of mass casualty terrorism has been politically beneficial. You know, Republicans have emphasized that, or trying to tie Iraq to September 11th and this sort of thing. But I think that it doesn't mean that you couldn't have political leaders that would talk more sensibly about a graduated threat and trying to, instead of using the single blanket term terrorism to cover everything from a car bomb going off in Baghdad to September 11th, you know, you can disaggregate these threats and try to talk to people about you know, what the real level of the problem is.
That would be nice. What worries me a little is that the average Democratic presidential candidate, should he or she become president, would be under a lot of pressure just because he or she is a Democrat to prove his or her manhood, and would, in a way, oddly, have more trouble selling that line, you know, than others might. But
I agree. The Democrats have got a real problem in trying to articulate this without seeming weak or without seeming to minimize the problem, and being very politically vulnerable. The other problem, I think, in our politics is this you know, cover your ass problem, that even if you believe that the problem is a fairly low probability one, you don't want to be caught in the position of having minimized it and then having something go wrong. And so just from the standpoint of your individual political survival, it's always more easy to you know, to hype the problem than to...
And by the same token, you don't get credit if you're president for, like, calming everyone down and then that leading to less terrorism, because the chain of causality is never clear.
That's
if you go out and kill somebody who's a suspected terrorist, they see that.
That's right.
So the incentive structure is a little screwed up. Speaking of presidential candidates, Do you have any clearer ideas? I remember you were not a Hillary fan last time we spoke. I think because you said it's just kind of too dynastic to keep alternating between Bushes and Clintons. But do you have any more thoughts on that? Barack Obama's stock, I think, has fallen a little since we spoke, partly because of some ill-advised utterances, and partly because the Hillary machine seems pretty competent.
Yeah, I don't think anything's changed since then. I think it's her nomination and ultimately election to lose, and she seems to be so completely self-controlled that I don't think she's going to screw up in a big way. So.
Yeah. I mean, if it quickly enough became conventional wisdom that Edwards and Obama just could not do it, I'm not sure it's too late for Al Gore to enter the race, but he'd have to get a lot more enthusiastic about that within about 2 weeks, I think, for that to not be too late.
Yeah, I suspect that's right.
And I think he can only do it if the conventional wisdom becomes that he's the only Hillary alternative.
And then, even then, he's got this huge fundraising disadvantage to overcome, so I don't really see how that works. And plus, with everybody racing to move their primaries into January, we've got this, terrible situation where you're, in effect, going to have a national primary that's going to be decided by which candidate has the most money to spend.
That's true, although he could generate the cash and support a lot faster than any other new entry could. And as I said, the premise would have to be that Obama and Edwards are hopeless, and so the kind of a lot of progressives who don't like Hillary move to Gore. But it's not looking likely.
Right.
So you also went to you went to France. One question. Obviously in France, I'm sure you encountered some people who aren't enthusiastic about America, but that actually is, of course, a phenomenon that predates Bush. I went to France a couple of times briefly before Bush was president, and I never got the idea that anybody was very happy to see me there. I mean, is that your long-standing impression about France?
Well, I don't think it's directed at Americans particularly.
It's just foreigners, it's just non-French.
Well, I think the French actually like the United States. If you go to any national park in the West, everybody around you is going to be speaking French. And I think Sarkozy, when people question why he was vacationing in the United States, said, well, I'm doing the same thing that 600,000 French people do every year. The United States is, the prime destination spot for French people. So I'm not so sure. Well, maybe they like the rocks and desert better than Americans per se. But if you really hated Americans, it's hard to see why so many would end up coming here.
Do you have any other big impressions of France, pro or con?
Well, I think that it's very interesting what Sarkozy is doing right now, because the society, I think, is really in a fair amount of trouble. When Dominique de Villepin introduced these really minor efforts to free up the French labor market, the whole country was closed down by students basically wanting to defend their right to public employment and to state protections of a increasingly small job pool, which was just an absurd situation. And the real challenge for I think Sarkozy or any future leader of France is to break out of that trap that they're in, and I think he's got as good a chance of doing it as anyone, because he really does have a certain flair. I think it's absolutely brilliant to try to co-opt the socialists in the way that he's done, and now he's got to package these necessary reforms in a way that somehow doesn't generate the kind of opposition that Margaret Thatcher generated when she tried to do it, because in France it's just not Britain. They're not going to go along with this open assault on their welfare state, and so it's got to be done in a much more clever way. But I think if anyone's likely to do it, Sarkozy is the only French politician I've seen that could pull it off.
We talked about how important it is, in states with a large Muslim population to kind of keep them on your side. Isn't Sarkozy just kind of intrinsically antagonistic in that regard in France?
I don't think so. He's done a lot of interesting... first of all, I actually believe that of all of the countries in Europe, the French, in a way, have the best record in terms of assimilating Muslims. It's not great, but given the size of the population, I think that they've done a better job than Holland or Britain, for that matter.
But that's not really the perception you get from just casually reading the news.
Well, it's not, and you had all these riots in the Bosnia and so forth, but I do not think that, I think that that was actually a social problem much closer to the Watts riots or things that we've experienced in American inner cities. It's joblessness in minority communities, but it's not driven by Islamism or a particular ideology that is kind of anti-Western in some deep sense. So they've got this huge social problem. There's a lot of racism and exclusion, but I think, given how large their Muslim population is, they actually, in a way, have many more assimilated Muslims.
And I guess would Sarkozy, in principle, be in favor of this initiative that failed after the riots in France? Although it sure seemed like a good idea to me, and it's the following. There's apparently a law in France that once you hire somebody, you can't fire them for like a long time, like a year or something. I don't know what it is, but the point is, it's a disincentive for employers to take risks on new employees. So, if you're not going to be able to fire somebody, you look for somebody, they're kind of like you, they're on the same page, they remind you of your son or something, right? You're going to be less inclined to hire some Muslim who seems more culturally alien. And there was this movement in France to change that so that you could actually fire employees. But there was a backlash and it didn't happen, right?
Well, I think the European welfare state is a big impediment to the assimilation of new immigrants because, the one thing we've got going for us in the United States is because we have very liberal labor laws where we can hire and fire people, we are a huge generator of low-skill employment. And so virtually every immigrant, including all of the illegal ones that people complain about, are coming here because they're working. And I think work is really critical, morally critical to assimilation into the society. That's what gives you dignity and status. And in Europe, I think this is different. The dignity comes less from work and comes more from being a citizen and a member of solidarity community, this broader solidarity community, which means that a lot of immigrants are actually on welfare. And because of the rigidities in the labor laws, it's not just France, but many European countries have these laws that, quote unquote, protect workers. Whoops. You get this big problem of not being able to hire low-skill immigrant workers.
Okay.
So they really got to solve this.
Yeah, no, I think so. Now you went to Japan, and our younger viewers will not recall that, I don't know, I guess 18, 20 years ago, Japan was viewed in some corners in the United States as a threat almost the way radical Islam is now. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but it was this emerging economic power. They were different from
China.
us.
It's like we regard China now, really.
Yeah, in a way. There was almost a more fear mongering. I mean, there was this Michael Crichton book came out. Was it Rising Sun or something? And there was, I would not put this in the fear-mongering category, and if Jim Fallows were here, he would emphatically not put it that way, but there was his cover story in the Atlantic that I think was called Containing Japan or something. Now I know, if you talk to him, he'll say, read the piece itself, I wasn't off base, fine, and maybe this will be an incentive for him to come on Blogging Heads and make that case, but... you remember the atmosphere. There were people genuinely scared, and also it was, on the part of American labor, there was that strain of concern about American jobs. But but anyway, nobody's talking that way about Japan now, right?
Right. They went through the doldrums for 10 years where they barely grew 1% a year. And then they've got this demographic problem that their absolute population has been shrinking for the last several years, and so they're depopulating themselves at a more rapid rate than any other industrialized country. And so over the long run, it's just hard to see how they maintain their competitive position. Their economy has recovered, but I think one of the big problems in the world now is that their trajectory and China's are going to cross at a certain point in the not too distant future, and I think that's what's causing a lot of the tension in Asia.
And there is, I guess it's interesting because we were worried about an overly assertive Japan then. It seems to me now, if anything, I might worry about a Japan whose self-esteem is too low. And what I'm thinking of is the way they're handling their historical memory in terms of acknowledging kind of some of the less nice things they did, in World War II and so on. And that's a real source of friction with them and their neighbors. Did you, while you were there, did you sense that there is a self-esteem problem? And am I right that this historical memory problem is actually more pronounced than it was 15 or 20 years ago?
Oh, yeah, no. The left, in the form of the Japan Socialist Party, has collapsed. And that was a traditional obstacle to the assertion of this extreme right in Japan that has always been there. But in a way has become much more, a much bigger political player in the last, really since Koizumi started going back to Yasukuni. So people may not understand this, but the current Prime Minister, Abe, a lot of his career in Parliament was made around these nationalist issues. For example, denying that the Korean comfort women were actually coerced into brothels by the Japanese army. That was one of his big issues before he became Prime Minister. So there's this a lot of revisionism that's gone on in Japan. And, a certain part of the Japanese population, it's a minority, but it's a significant one that really never feels that they did anything wrong, particularly in the 1930s and 40s. And so the Chinese and Koreans, when they see this, the Japanese have officially apologized, but they see that there's a part of the political spectrum that is really not at all apologetic, and I think that's really the source of the continuing frictions.
So did you come away concerned about the possibility of really consequential friction in that area between Japan and its neighbors?
I was actually more concerned about this a year or so ago because there really was a lot of people who had criticized Koizumi for going to Yasukuni Shrine. Their houses were getting firebombed and this sort of thing. I think that as time has gone on, there's been a bigger discussion of this within Japan and a realization that Koizumi, in a way, had really tanked the whole relationship with both China and Korea, and that they couldn't let this continue. And now Abe is such an unpopular politician that I think the headwind that the nationalists were getting has been, is no longer there. And so I'm a little bit more relaxed about it. But I think if this problem is not settled. For example, this current Japanese government is committed to revising Article 9 of the post-war Constitution, which forbids Japan from having a military. It's a so-called peace article. They can do this, I think, quite legitimately, but if they do under the leadership of these kinds of nationalists without consulting with China and Korea, those two countries are just going to go ballistic, and that's it's a crisis that's waiting to happen. So I think that there are some time bombs buried there that really need to be managed very carefully.
And do you speak Japanese?
No.
You don't?
No.
Japan is another society that, like France, is said to not extend an especially warm welcome to maybe formally they do, but a number of people who visit there have gotten the sense that they weren't of something less than effusive warmth.
Yeah, well, my favorite, when I lived in Los Angeles, my favorite bumper sticker was the one that said, "Welcome to L.A., now get the hell out."
Yeah.
So I think, a lot of societies are the first impression, and the deeper one is, can be very different. I think that in Japan, the experience of a lot of Westerners that live in Japan is that it's really very hard to penetrate that society because there's a great deal of superficial, politeness and welcome. But there are very deep cultural traditions that bind that society together, and so it's quite hard to get on the inside of that. And I think that's probably more true in a relatively homogeneous country like Japan than it is in China, or certainly when you get down to Southeast Asia, where you've got ethnic diversity and a lot of different cultural traditions.
Yeah, no, I've heard that. I've heard that people say that in China, you find more in the way of cultural alignment with America than you might expect, partly because there actually is, notwithstanding the decades of communism, an ancient kind of market-oriented tradition or something. I don't know if that's somebody told me.
Well, I think the market traditions are strong in both societies, but I think the Chinese are much more individualistic, where it's an individualism of families. There's a saying that characterized Chinese society as a loose tray of sand, and Japan is more of a block of granite, that there's more competition among Chinese families than there would be in Japan, where nation and other kind of larger binding political, cultural sources of unity, I think, are much more pronounced than in China.
Okay. And finally, you also visited Papua New Guinea.
Right.
My only contact with that society is, in the course of writing books, reading anthropological writings about it from Western anthropologists in the late 19th and early 20th century who visited there and studied horticultural societies, or I guess in some case maybe even hunter-gatherer societies that had little or no contact with the West, and asked them about their various gods and so on. By the time you got there, they were having elections, I guess.
That's right.
What was that like?
It's really fascinating. This trip really came out of my interest in state building because Papua New Guinea was a so-called acephalous society until the European colonial powers got there in the late 19th century, and it was a colony of Australia up until 1975. The Australians tried to build a modern state on top of a extremely difficult society. There are over 800 separate languages spoken. The country is
still,
cut up
even
into
today.
these, yeah, even today. The country is cut up into these tiny little mountainous valleys where one tribe or clan really doesn't see beyond the next hill to the next one. And so anything like national identity or a sense of Papua New Guinean nation is really totally missing there. So it's a very challenging environment to build modern political institutions. And it means, for example, that members of parliament get elected with 10 to 12% of the vote of their electorate, because everybody's basically voting for their clan and not for a national political party. So it's a very it upsets all of the general rules of political science that comparativists come up with. But it's also, and this is why it's studied by anthropologists in the highlands. The first time that they ever saw a white person was in the mid-1930s, and so you get some parts that...
Really?
Right.
Huh. Well, so I take it back about the late 19th century Western anthropologists then.
Yeah. Yeah, and some very famous anthropologists that you are familiar with, like Bronislaw Malinowski, his book on the Trobriand Islands.
Right.
This is basically right off of Papua New Guinea, and it shares in this very interesting matrilineal culture that a lot of the island parts of Papua share. And so, and the other thing anthropologists like is that there are so many different societies at an early stage of development that it's just a great place for comparative anthropology.
But the database is getting corrupted pretty fast, I guess, by modernization.
Well, that's kind of what the development people tear their hair out about. It's a society that's actually quite resistant to modernization, and so you can still study intact cultural traditions there in ways that are not possible in many parts of Africa. In Rabaul, for example, where I was, you have this whole system of in the Tolai society of ducks and the secret societies that preserve in their initiation ceremonies this extremely tightly bonded society that means that they don't really like to emigrate. Australia does not have the Haitian problem that the United States has, because people in these societies really want to stay.
They don't want to go
stay
there.
put. Yeah. So it's still pretty good field for anthropologists.
Is it still what is often called animist in religion, or was there a lot of Christianization?
No, it's completely Christian. Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of there are cargo cults, and there are the traditional forms of shamans and people believing in spirits that completely coexist with evangelical Christianity. In a lot of Highlands villages, you'll get to these places that you cannot reach even by road, and there'll be a big Pentecostal or Jehovah's Witness church right in the middle of the village. So it's one of the most Christian societies anywhere on Earth.
Well, the cargo
and indeed, we went also to the Indonesian side of the island, to Indonesian Papua. The only way to get into the highlands is on a mission airplane. The Catholics and the Protestants all run their own separate airlines, and they're really the only ones that get into a lot of these remote villages.
So were the people friendly there?
Very friendly. It's really a great it's a really great place.
Would you recommend it as a vacation spot?
There's a certain amount of ecotourism there. It's the most beautiful place. The only problem is it's just so damn far away, because to get there you really basically got to get first to Australia, which is a challenge in itself, and then travel within Papua New Guinea is not all that easy. But once you're there, it's just a marvelous society.
Yeah, you got to be good at arranging junkets if you're going to get all the way to Papua New Guinea. That's why I seek your guidance on that front.
Right.
This has been a great report.
Okay.
Actually, one more question about Papua New Guinea. Where would you guess it's going to be in 20 or 30 years? What would you guess it's going to be like?
I think the rate of economic growth has barely kept up with population growth over the last 30 years since independence, and in a way the big challenge is that they've got resources. They got timber and minerals and a little bit of energy, but it's been a very, it's not led to broad-based economic development, because a lot of it gets corrupted, and so how they handle that will affect things a lot. I suspect that it's not going to be terribly different in a lot of ways. That they'll continue on this relatively slow growth path, and then they'll have pockets of modernization.
Well, then maybe by the time I get there, there will still be some ecotourism to do.
Right.
A lot of a certain amount of your writing about this travel is on your website, on the American Interest website. There's also, by the way, what looks to be a very interesting piece by Walter Russell Mead, arguing that although people think of kind of highly religious societies and rapidly modern societies as alternative models, in fact, societies that have been on the cusp of modernization, like Britain in the 19th century and America in the 20th, have actually often tended to be highly religious societies. And so I haven't read the whole piece, but that seems like an interesting argument to evaluate.
Well, Walter continues in the tradition of Max Weber and Tocqueville and a lot of other observers of the United States in arguing that actually the kind of sectarian Protestantism that you saw culturally in the United States was not opposed to democracy as many people for the American way tend to believe, but was absolutely a support both for pluralism and for capitalism, and I think he's basically right about that.
Yeah, although I never got the way the Protestant work ethic was supposed to work, because the idea, it was predestinarian, right? I mean, it's already been determined whether you're going to heaven or hell, but you should work really hard so that people will think you're going to heaven, even though it won't affect the chances?
Well, right, it was the external signs of election, but that's not Walter's argument.
Yeah.
The argument is much more about pluralism, that the sectarian nature of Protestantism was inherently competitive, and it set up a kind of marketplace of religious belief, which meant that you wouldn't have domination by a single church, and that this was an important social support for the kind of diverse civil society that grew up, Tocqueville's famous art of association.
Okay, well, maybe we should get him on to talk about
Right.
that. And meanwhile, his piece is on your website,
Right.
along with the other stuff. So thanks a
Okay.
lot, Frank.
Okay.
I hope we'll do this before your next trip around the world. But
Okay.
if not, let's do it then.
All right.
Okay.
Very good.
See ya.